now
One, two, one, two.
it is ready, so all you need to do is hit the right arrow.
It's a new day.
But yeah, you don't have to start right away.
I know. How'd study group go today?
Oh, it was last Saturday.
Did you finish? Are you still there?
Yeah, we're down to the last two chapters. Yeah.
We're halfway through like construction. That's quite an
The one we're reading next is the people's history of the United States.
Oh, cool. Zimmer?
And then after that is how Europe underdeveloped after that.
That's good.
Those are two big ass books.
Huh?
Those are two big ass books.
All out of coffee, Dave?
Yeah, it's tea. It's really good.
And we're all waiting for you.
Oh, damn, I'm sorry.
Oh, we're done. Y'all can start now. You're early?
Yeah.
I mean, technically, he's early. Technically, for him, he's early.
Where's your Cornell West button?
I know, right?
Totally
He
unprepared.
just started his store today.
What's up, man? Good to see you.
What do you have here?
Whatever it is.
I like this. Ah, go ahead, go ahead.
No, I really do.
So guys, you love this? And
Ready when you are, Dave.
you good to go?
Yeah.
Alright. Well, thank you all for coming. Let me present, it's not that, the second in our National Question series with Taiji T. Miyagawa and Peter Garnica. This time we're focusing on the Indigenous National Question and the importance of centering Indigenous people in your organizing. So let me introduce Peter Garnica.
Thanks everybody for coming on out to Midnight Books tonight. My name is Taiji, and this is like not a topic that I had a lot of knowledge with, you know, and which is really terrible for as long as I've been around. But I think a lot of other non-Indigenous people, and even maybe some Indigenous people, can relate. It's not like we're taught a lot about the original people, right? Which is really insane. And I think things are moving in the right direction in the sense that, you know, like when you go to like progressive events, most people will introduce it as saying that we're here on stolen land, right? But this is actually the first time I'm participating in a mixed group discussion about what are we going to do about it, you know? And so how this relates to the national question that we went across the last time, which I hope everybody can watch the video on at nationalquestion.org, is because we've gone through a period of the early colonial stage, which was an international phenomenon, right? And then we went through a period of national liberation phase, right, where the colonizer was kicked out of the colonies, right? And then, I'll take my mask off, sorry. And then we entered a stage that's called neocolonialism, right, wherein the basic economic relationship with a lot of these former colonies is still fundamentally the same, but now we have a brown, Asian, or black face as an intermediary, right? And that, we talked about how it also correlates domestically, where we have black, brown, Asian politicians that are speaking on behalf of our communities, or possibly non-profit or NGO structures that are speaking on our behalves, but they are embedded with the neoliberal power structure, right? That's has its primary allegiance with the capitalist class, right? So, in a nutshell, if we look at the U.S., we haven't been taught about indigenous people. As well-read and gifted they were as intellectuals, Marx, Engels, Lenin, they're not from this country. They're not from this hemisphere, right? We cannot turn to them for an analysis, at least where we are right now, of how these indigenous national questions relate to the overall fight, against imperialism. But this might not be a common position on the left, but it is my personal position that this country was founded on genocide of indigenous people. It was founded on the theft of the land and all of the natural resources and enslavement of indigenous people. How did the U.S. get rich so fast? That's how it got rich so fast. I mean, the massive amount of resources from end to end, both sides of this country, right? The enslavement of African Americans, later on the annexation of the Southwest, and basically, effectively Chinese slave labor, right? Other Asian slave labor. So I think that the indigenous question is really important, but more than that, and this applies for all indigenous people around the world, it has to do with what is our relationship with the planet, and what is our relationship to the soil beneath our feet, and how we're interacting with natural processes, right? And so that's what we're trying to get to tonight and bring it full circle, as the original national questions are the indigenous national questions. So that's what we're trying to get to. Thank you, Gabe and Midnight Books, for hosting this event. They've been reprinting a lot of articles on the national question that have been selling like hotcakes, which is really inspiring to me. It's kind of an obscure question. Most of the left doesn't address the national question here in this country because they have this thing called white supremacy, I think, affecting their consciousness a little bit. So it's a pretty big deal that that Midnight Books is helping us with these programs. There's a lot of debate about decolonization theory and process on the left. It's been going on for a long time, but we're going to use this one for now, which includes both the structural concerns about dealing with colonization and neo-colonization, but we're going to also include the way that Frantz Fanon talks about it, which is also the effects on our psychology and the cultural dimension, right? How our minds are also colonized, right? How we look at each other, our identities, and what stances we decide to take. And it's a global issue, right? So again, even though we're going to be focused on this area of the world, keep in mind that we're trying to put it in an international context too. And these are just pictures of the people we're trying to center. Is anybody here indigenous or has some indigenous blood? Obviously, some people have lineages, right? But no tribal members directly. Okay, thank you. They're everywhere. They're all around us. So I'm going to hand it off to my friend here. He happens to be Chichimeca, and I came across this slide the other night, and I thought it was really funny because he was telling me a story about how somebody was referring to him as Latinx, and he was rejecting it because he's Chichimeca. And so this other person refused to respect that request. And so when I saw this slide, I thought this is going to be perfect for a Chichimeca. Let me introduce Peter Garnica. He's a good friend of mine. He's a very longtime artist. He's much more well-read than I am on this topic. I went to his house and tried to take some of these photos out of his books, and he brought like about 50 books, right? Some of them were like missing the front cover. He'd been read for so long and everything. He has a monstrous amount of knowledge. He's been cracking my brain for about the last 2 weeks as we've been preparing for this thing. But I'm really glad that he's here to share some information. Thank you, Peter.
Let me just apologize because we actually had a indigenous person invited to come to this, but she wasn't able to make it. She will make it at the next one that we have specifically on indigenous questions. And I met her at a market actually, and she spoke with the wisdom, direct wisdom of a person who's connected to the earth and has incredible wisdom about plants. And knowledge of all the local native nations within the Los Angeles basin and other places too, and San Clemente Island, etc. Let me first say that it was a long process and time for me to identify with the Chichimeca. I didn't realize at first, although I was fortunate enough, like many of you probably don't have, I had a grandmother that we always knew was pure-blooded Indian, and her grandmother, who was a curandera, or her mother, who was my great-grandmother, who was a curandera. So we knew we were Indian, and my paternal grandfather was mestizo, and we knew they came from Mexico, actually fleeing the revolution. My grandmother hid my grandfather. She was 13 years old. Hid my grandfather in a corn crib to escape the federal troops who were trying to draft him, right? My dad also talks about seeing people hung from telephone lines. I don't think that was the revolution. I think that was later on during the Cruzado period, if you guys are familiar with the Cruzado period. So my knowledge of what went on and my lineage was a very long process. I had that knowledge of my grandmother. I was fortunate to have that. Later on, I lived with her after high school for about a year. And at that time, I realized that she definitely had a different way of thinking than I had learned. I was raised and born in Santa Barbara. Don't think that everybody in Santa Barbara is wealthy. We were all poor, right? It was only later on that wealthy people moved into Santa Barbara. We were all poor people, took care of the wealthy people in Santa Barbara, mostly white Europeans. So I was taught, my parents, of course, we have conquest psychology. Of course, they taught me English as my first language because we were going to be working with white people. And everybody I knew that I grew up with at the time learned English as their primary language. So, and of course, Spanish was easy for me to pick up living with my grandmother. But what's most interesting is that she saw things as Mesoamericans did, as native indigenous people in Mexico did. She saw, like, for instance, death and life were constant and well on different parallels. The dead were constantly with us. And during that period, I assimilated those ways of thinking, right? There was no question about it. That was a reality to her. She was aware of her own mother all the time. And one of the other instances of that Indianness was, and by the way, I'm going to use these terms variously because they've been used differently throughout our history. Her idea of the Virgin of Guadalupe is really an Indian version of Guadalupe. The Virgin of Guadalupe is really the mother goddess, right, that we all know about, and she saw her as that. And Native Americans see the Virgin. You guys probably know the history here. They see her as an Indian, and the symbology in the painting, Indians immediately recognized. So all these ideas came to me, and I became aware, little by little, of my roots, and my search went on. And during the period that I was in college, I would hear instances of references to America. Basis for American democracy was in Indian writings, the Native American teachings, and I didn't know what that was, and I had to search for it. It wasn't only after I graduated was doing union work that I had time to really start researching this stuff, and of course I found out where these resources were. But they were mingled, and it wasn't until 1988 a guy by the name of a Caucasian man by the name of Jack Weatherford, who was a college professor, wrote a book, and an anthropologist wrote a book called Indian Givers, in which he said, he used a term which is generally a pejorative term, and he used it in an opposite way, saying that American Indians really were the givers. They gave, and what they gave changed the whole world, had a huge impact on the world, everything that they gave. So in that book, he references a whole lot of things and put a lot of beliefs that I had together that I had referred or got references from other sources. So there became a consistency in what I came to believe. So getting all these feelings, and I was reaching something that I think Taiji does too. We have a feeling of growth, which I didn't realize comes from this indigenousness that we have. That life is about growth. It's not about stopping. Conventional society says you grow and go through stages, and each time you stop developing. But the indigenous way, and actually in Carl Jung's way of thinking, it's called individuation. You're allowed to maximize your potential. You reach your full potential. That's a very indigenous way of thinking. And I see that in the woman that I wanted to be here today. We will get a chance to see her later on. So anyway, that was a process that I was going through. And when I suddenly realized what the whole thing that I was involved with, I started searching. I said, well, my parents came from Guanajuato. I know exactly where we came from. Both sides of the family have traditional properties there and ranches there that go back generations and generations. It is in Guanajuato and Silao, which is the Guamare area, Guatemala Chuchumeca, who are called the Cloud People, who are, if you know, it was a federation of 8 tribes that federated against the Aztecs, so they were never defeated by the Aztecs, so they call it Chuchumeca, which means basically barbarian, loosely. So nobody wanted to be Chichimeca until recently. That's all changing now. But they not only defeated the Aztecs, but they resisted the Spaniards. The Spaniards never defeated them. They never defeated them. And they fought something like a 30-year war against them. And finally they gave up. And they stopped with them and they said, hey, we're going to give you all this stuff. But what they did do is they Christianized them. But their level of Christianization was totally different from the Christianization that they wanted to do. They syncretized their religion with images that they knew. So they remained the same. Doesn't matter whether you're mixed blood or what, you still remain indigenous. This should resonate with some people because most Mexicans and Chicanos know where their people came from. There was a lot of movement and a lot of change, but many people should be able to follow the same process. Jack Weatherford said that uses the no border idea when he talks about the gifts that Native American people gave to the world. He uses no borders. He uses the whole idea that indigenous people are from the tip of South America to Canada and Alaska. So the potato, the tomato, the corn, squash, all the things that are really important, tobacco, all these things. Quinine, medicines, all these things came from Native people. So no borders were all the same. And this is where we want to go. We want people to understand that. And by the way, everything we say is controversial. We don't expect you to believe everything we say because almost everything can be questioned, right? So we just want you to use your powers of critical analysis, of critical thinking, whether it be Marxist analysis or critical theory analysis. That's what we want you to do. We want you to look at because we all have cultural impositions due to the post-colonial period. They're so powerful that we aren't even aware of our own prejudices. So there's certain things I can refer to, like Gordon Allport's the 1955 book on the nature of prejudice, which people might be able to look at, that you could see how these things get into our minds and we're not even aware of them. And that's what we want people to look at. We also look at it in terms of how our people are disappeared. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. We've got like a total of 99 slides, believe it or not. And I know when Gabe first saw it, I'm sure he was going, like, it's not going to be a 5-hour long program, is it? But we're going to try to zip through them. Like Peter said, we're not trying to come up with a definitive answer to a lot of things. And, we're doing this thing because the problems in the world right now, everybody knows, we're at the crisis stage, right? I mean, the planet, we're losing, I mean, Canada's on fire, had record temperatures in the Antarctic. It's supposed to be winter, right? Record temperatures all around the world, Spain. We're losing all of the stuff that was gained in the last 2-3 generations in terms of affirmative action, right? They're banning books written by our people. They're in some states going back on child labor laws now. They've got like 14-year-olds working in factories again. I mean, it's insane. And their side has said straight up, they're going to go after all of it. So they're not going to stop until we can accumulate enough power to stop them. We don't have that power right now. So my position is that we have to sharpen up our strategy, which means we have to sharpen up our analysis. We have to better understand ourselves, and figure out a way forward, right? And also learn from each other. So that's what tonight is. So this next section is just going to be on origination theory, right? Peter mentioned it. There was this, the world, right? That was called Pangea, right? And it was a controversial topic at one point, but geological studies pretty much confirmed the movement of tectonic plates was used to be all one landmass once upon a time. These words right here, giving a nod to what Peter said, South America, North America, we have a problem with this workshop because we don't have the language to define where we are, right? And by default, we're using settler colonizer language. As soon as you use that word, what's happening? You're disappearing indigenous people, right? Even if you say Western Hemisphere, West according to what? Who's at the center of that term? You see what I'm saying? So we need to dig deeper, explore indigenous languages, and lift up their language. If they don't have their language anymore because it was taken from them, I'm proposing we make up a new damn language. Because these old European-centric words, they got to go. Because in our active interaction with each other, these are the little ways that we maintain settler colonialism, right? So anyway, Pangea theory, so that you go, the pieces of continent, like a piece of puzzle, and eventually they spread apart. This is the Peters projection map, which is a more accurate way of showing the world than the Mercator map. The map that we grew up on, those little globes in elementary school, they're inaccurate because they favor the north. This is actually much more accurate, the relative square mileage space of Mother Africa relative to the United States, right? And all of the Eurocentric, American-centric.
It's still, actually, South America is about almost 3 times bigger than
Yeah, so
North
it's
America.
not, there's still some distortion.
Yeah,
There's different ways that they lay out the map that isn't on a horizontal
Yeah.
plane that are, more accurate, but it's way more accurate than Mercator map. Okay, and then, so again, we're going to be focusing on this region of the world. One of the earliest theories that most of us grew up was the Bering landmass theory, which is that the indigenous people came over from Siberia area, Central Asia, when during the Ice Age there was a solid land ice mass between the two continents. And that was a theory for a long time. This is the same theory showing the migration pattern from the northwest. But then, in recent times, more archaeological evidence. Peter, help me out when I forget words and stuff. What was this one called again? The
Clovis Point?
Clovis Point. Yeah. So this is an analysis. You can explain the Clovis Point a little, Peter.
Well, the Clovis Point, as they understand it, originated in probably in Siberia. They found traces of all over, so it very likely came from that area of Asia. And of course, they found traces of the Clovis Point all the way down to South America. And of course, the name of it originates in Clovis, Clovis here in the United States. But the Clovis Point is pretty sophisticated. There were other points later on that were more sophisticated, but this was very, very sophisticated. So there's no question about where it came from and who those people are, because the pattern of the flaking of the obsidian is consistent no matter where they
There's
find
time
it.
date stamping, right?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So interesting enough, the Clovis Point theory or in study leads credence to a different kind of origination that people came over here by way of coastal migration, including some of them coming from Siberia, but there's also some possibility that people might have come from the ocean, natural ocean streams, what did they call it, currents in the Pacific, and possibly from other parts of the Pacific Islands. But currently, the coastal migration theory is the most predominant, and we've got a lot of tons of corroborating evidence from different places like Middle Alaska. Also, what was this? I think this is around. Huh?
Idaho.
Yeah, Idaho. Thank you. And what's interesting about these different Clovis points is that the time date stuff is very similar across a pretty wide geography. Here's what's this? This is a slightly different piece of evidence. Some footprints at White Sands. This is from Florida. All around 15,000 BCE time period. This one is interesting because I think in one of these sites in South America, they correlated some of the DNA study with DNA from Idaho. So this is all the way in South America, pretty long ways to walk, right? But imagine your long lost cousin is now in South America after growing up with them. DNA from a baby tooth in Alaska. Anyway, there's tons of this stuff. I have a second cousin that helped me out a lot with this archaeological stuff. Okay, so that's the coastal theory, which is the reigning archaeological theory. Nothing's set in stone; it's all fluid, based upon what might be discovered in the future. For example, they haven't gotten much stuff from the shoreline of the Pacific, right? So even if you assume that coastal migration came down the shoreline, well, that shoreline was a lot different during the Ice Age or early or late Ice Age than it is now, right? So there's probably a lot of stuff underneath there that needs to be discovered and analyzed. So, it's an ongoing process. There is a theory that those brown-skinned people in Central America couldn't possibly have built those pyramids, right? They couldn't have possibly figured out how to make their own clock. They couldn't have possibly been able to study the stars and come up with the concept of astrology, right? And it wasn't them that built the observatory because they're brown-skinned. How could that be possible, right? Only white people are smart, right? So that theory is out there. There's been a couple of popular TV shows with that. If you run into anybody that adheres to that theory, I would say turn around and go do something else with your life because it's not worth your time. Pre-Mayan Aztec societies, the Olmecs, I've always thought that the facial features of the Olmecs didn't indicate a European feature, possibly African, possibly Pacific Islander, we don't know, but this is in the what area? Mexico, Veracruz, and Tabasco. Machu Picchu, which Peter wanted to say something about.
Oh, the other thing to say about Machu Picchu, it was actually an area of resistance that we know of.
Incas, right?
That people escaped to Machu Picchu. There have been some more recent findings to indicate that was one of the reasons that they were there. So that you can look at that as a point of resistance. But we'll talk about that later.
Mm-hmm. So you probably heard about some of the advanced civilization of the Mayan Empire, right? Very, very high level scientists, right? The concept of zero in mathematics, right? Which I still don't understand. But I know that it has to do with how these phones work. Their calendar, right? Which is similar to the Aztec calendar. I don't know how to read it, but obviously they figured this stuff out. They were studying the skies. And once again, related to a certain kind of humility and aspiration to be one with the natural laws of the mother of all mothers, the planet, and the universe in which we live. And this is where Tenochtitlan, the Aztec Empire's hub, Montezuma's hangout, another artist rendition. I'm not sure where this is, but I just wanted to show it because I think it, once again, confirms that there were pretty high-level civilizations in different parts of Latin America. And then this is some tribes called this area land. They had a word, it was called Turtle Island, which is probably a better term to use than the Vespucci term of North America. I don't know what terms they have for Central America. I said we should just make one up. Call it what do you want to call it? Middle world or something like that, or where we are. This is the California tribes here, might be hard to see from the back, but at one point California was the most linguistically diverse area in the world, right? I don't remember the numbers, Peter, a lot though. Yeah. And this is right before Columbus came, and I'm going to let Peter waddle through this next part.
Oh, what part is that?
Yeah. The fun stuff. And-
We're past the, okay.
Yeah, and so you're going to have to do this one here. Here we go. Ready?
Oh, okay, very good.
Not too long, not too detailed. But what
No,
is
this
stuff?
is an interesting stuff because, of course, we think of most of the settlers that came to the Americas were from Asia or the Pacific Islands, Pacific Rim. This is a guy who's actually a botanist, so he knew scientific method really well, but he became aware of certain things that were going on in Vermont. And there was a whole group of people that were I don't know how you say it, epigraphers. They're people that study languages. And there were all these things on stones that were found all over the East Coast. And
These were in West Virginia.
yeah, they determined that these things were actually a language called Ogham, right? Ogham appears in different periods throughout ancient history in various ways, from pre-Christian to post-Christian, Celtic to Punic. So allegedly, according to Val and the people that work with him, other peoples came to the Americas long before the original Europeans did.
These are Iberian from Spain.
Yes, yeah, they would be Punic people. Yeah. So they also suggest that Egyptians were here, that some of these people had temporary colonies here, and by the way, long before Leif Erikson, right? And that they left evidence of some of some of their languages within some of the tribes. Like there's language isolates among Native Americans, and according to Val and his people, in looking at linguistics and language symbols, they say that some of these languages in these isolated areas originated with these early people that came here. This is really interesting. Traditional and conventional archaeologists and other scientists totally blast this whole idea. To me, it seems logical. The world was a small world, much smaller than we've seen. People traveled and traded all over the place. Mm-hmm. And there's evidence that the Europeans, Northern Europeans, traded for copper. They needed copper for bronze. There's copper mines along the Great Lakes. And Native Americans used copper for trade. There's evidence of that. You can see it in the museum. So all these things were happening. It really did happen. There's no question in my mind. We know that trade occurred all over the place, that people moved. The world was just a much smaller place than we think it is now. People were not static. They were not static at all. So this is really interesting stuff, and I think in the future, we talk about paradigm changes with plate tectonics. There's going to be a paradigm change here too eventually. I'm pretty convinced of it. So the idea that Native Americans say we were always here, that timeline as far as how long they were here is going to go much further than 15,000 years. There's evidence that they were here much longer than 40,000 years. So we'll see. Oh yeah, this is just a timeline, right?
Yeah.
There's some really interesting thing. What part is this? Are we dealing with Spanish?
Still colonialism. Yeah.
Pardon?
Spain's coming up next. So there was a lot of Europeans that came to this area. We're going to focus on the worst of them all, starting with the Spaniards. And since we're close part of Mexico, right, going to talk about Hernan Cortez. Go ahead.
Yeah, who was mentioning the fact that Cortez spent I forget how many years in Cuba before he.
No, I think somewhere in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
For about 7 years before he came to.
They didn't want
Mexico.
him to move into Mexico at all. They tried to keep him from doing that, and he pretty much went on his own. There is a pretty accurate movie in many ways. You can blast a lot of it, but there's a lot of accuracies in it, and that is the movie Captain from Castile, which is actually pretty good. But
George Romero, right?
yeah,
Oh.
Cesar Romero.
Cesar Romero, sorry, not George Romero. Oops.
If you get a chance, you can see some.
Played
real-
Batman on the Batman TV series way back.
Yeah, you can see some real accuracies in it. You can see some false stuff in it. For the most part, it's pretty good. So from a popular point, and you could see the you can see what's wrong with it too. But it's actually very good in Technicolor, actually.
Just describe it.
Yeah, this
We'll
is
stop moving through.
yeah, this is when Cortez met Moctezuma. Taiji was just saying that they gave him gold right away, but actually he was sending emissaries to Cortez when he first landed in Veracruz, I think it was, and so he was very aware of the wealth that was available. That there was nothing that was going to stop him. Nothing. He was determined to get his hands on that gold. Yeah, of course. There's a point here where is this Montezuma?
Yeah.
Where he asked him about why what was the thing about the gold? What was the big thing about? Because royalty did wear it, but the people who made it, they made incredible gems and jewelry out of it. So it was primarily for the royalty. But Cortez had to say that they had a disease, and that disease was lust for gold. He was right. It was true. And notice that these which were incredibly technologically developed, the gems and jewelry and golden jewelry, was all melted down, right? And a lot of it is used in the churches of Spain and stimulated the Industrial Revolution, frankly. Yeah, this is really interesting. Actually, believe it or not, this is a Chichimeca thing. Yeah, and of course this is a symbol, that's on the Mexican flag.
There were different codex.
Yeah.
Right? And basically the colonizers were documenting the life that they were seeking to annihilate.
Yeah, if you're familiar with the 7 caves, the origin of of Mexico City, that's actually also from a Chichimeca codex, which is really funny. Of course, the sophistication of corn, if we go back to what I was talking about the gifts that Weatherford talks about, corn, of course, is one of the major ones. And it was so sophisticated, and of course, it's from a grass. It was originally developed from a grass. It is so rich and so wealthy that, again, that's one of the things that stimulated growth and kept people from starving all around the world. It's been adopted for dry climate and dry weather growing, and in the Southwest they have varieties that grow in the desert. They don't need a lot of water. They water them to get them started, and then they leave them, and then they go back when they're ready to be cultivated. So some of those blue corns and black corns are amazing, and each of the indigenous people who use them specific ways. In the East Coast, of course, there's a different kind of corn that's grown, and of course, when the Americans, Euro-Americans, got a hold of it, they started monoculture, which is corn, right? And they used corn for all the wrong reasons, among other things. And that was the whole part of what we know now as
Now GMO.
post-colonial imposition, which really was ultimately about capitalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
So incredibly sophisticated ways of developing plants, and animals for that matter, but they hybridize also. What are we talking about here?
This is the East Coast, where I think it was about 5 major tribes were annihilated or displaced. before
Yeah,
the colonies came
when
in?
they first arrived here, you know, y'all know the story of Thanksgiving, and that was a lie, right?
Plymouth Rock was 1620.
Yeah, they immediately started killing off the Indians. So there is, I can't think of the name of it right now. There is an island that's really famous. I can't think of the name of the people, but around the turn of the century, the woman who was born, and the last native speaker of her people, who were among the people that that lived there. They're very mixed now from got a lot of black ancestry, Irish, everything else.
I might
But
not pronounce the names right, Peter, but it was Pequot,
that was one of the
Powhatan, and Massachusetts were wiped out or
Yeah.
severely displaced from the East Coast.
These people that stayed there, they didn't really disappear, are still there, and they all knew who they were. As mixed as they were, they knew who they were. They knew they have regular meetings and stuff. They're still there. And this woman had a dream, and she said, after the last native speaker died, she had a dream that they were going to be speaking the language again. So she went and she started studying, and they met with the tribal elders and stuff, and she was going to do that. She went on to college and started learning linguistics, and she got a grant to go to MIT, where, of course, Noam Chomsky lives, and is one of the great linguists. In an interview I saw talking with him, he's exactly the kind of person they needed there. And believe it or not, they were able to put the language back together from ancient writings and stuff that they had to dig up. And they do have native full native speakers now who can speak the language. This started a revival. Was the first of the revival people that was really successful. They're not the only people that are doing it now. The revival movement is really big. That's also resistance.
It's also decolonization.
Yeah.
So in the same way I was mentioning about the use of the Western names support settler colonialism and disappear indigenous, everybody knows, right, in the indigenous languages that developed over centuries of being part of this part of the world, there's many words that are connected with the spirituality consistent with the interests of this part of the planet, right, and the animals and the plant life surrounding by us that don't exist in the colonizer language, right? So it's not just that the European language disappears the indigenous, but it's also that the European language doesn't take into account centuries of integration with natural processes, right? Respect for those processes, you know what I mean? So it's a very profound disconnection, with the planet when we engage in the, I'm speaking English right now, right? But it's something that we need to be aware of. So I think the one thing that we want to hopefully present through different pieces of information is the different ways that decolonization happens and the different ways that people are resisting those processes. Right?
Yeah, remind me to talk about the wilderness thing. I don't know where I had that.
Okay, we can get that in the events.
By the way, is this from Barry Dow?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see, but up here is where the copper was mined. Up in here, and you can see there's Egyptian and other stuff that Barry Dow and his people determined happened. Controversial, but to me, I think ultimately it will be learned that there's truth there.
So one thing that happened, was that also harking back to the resistance issue is that I don't think the Europeans ever had an idea if they wanted to live harmoniously with the savages, right? Peter, you can go into a little the wilderness issue at some point, but maybe when we get to the advancement of the Western expansion.
Yeah, there was a distinct way of feeling that the Europeans had, and I have to say that a lot of this was a result of what the upper class imposed on the European poor people, right? The upper classes imposed a grid system, which they immediately imported to the United States, right? They built cities where poor people had to go, where they collected them so they could have their free labor and everything, right? They became dependent on the cities to be able to eat and everything, and to be able to get work. But it was free labor and cheap labor to the upper classes. The big thing is that they had also destroyed the forests, right? So there was a sense of wilderness, which means if you interpret it or if you analyze it, wilderness means wild, empty, void, right? Europeans came to be afraid of the wilderness. So the first thing they did when they came to the United States, what became the United States of America, they started cutting down trees. They got rid of the wilderness. They built cities, right? Now this was not universal. People, and you can read this among the early colonists that they kept on trying to get people to come to the Americas because people kept leaving.
Mm-hmm.
They escaped into and lived among the Indian people, and we know this happened, and the statistics show that it happened. What happened to those people? So not all. Well, it was so bad in the early colonies that people said, "Hey, we're not going to deal with this," and they left, and they went to live with Indians. So that's a real interesting thing.
So anyway, to accelerate the colonization process, they needed cheap labor, and there was this thing called the African slave trade at the time throughout the Atlantic region. Multiple European countries were engaged in this, including the Portuguese and the French, obviously the British. Most of the slaves actually, even though the U.S. caste system was probably the most heinous, the majority of the slaves were actually in other parts of the hemisphere. We'll just go through these horrific pictures really quick.
Yeah, we really didn't discuss the difference in how people looked at slaves.
You can go ahead and talk about it.
Very, very quickly, there was a distinct difference in how people south of the border looked at slavery and people north of the border looked at it. In the United States of America, up north of the border, slaves literally were property. Literally. There was no question about that. Down in south of the border, it was a little bit different. Several reasons for it. And it wasn't always consistent thinking, but there was a certain amount of, first of all, there was no way that they wanted to stop intermarriage. Intermarriage occurred, right? That was very, very typical. As soon as and you got to understand that the Native Americans in Mexico didn't do well as slaves. They were enslaved, but they didn't do well. They died and other things. So they brought in African slaves. But the African slaves were taken by Native Americans, and they didn't have a problem with it. Nor did the Mexican government, right? So there was a certain amount of pride in that. You guys who've studied this know about the Costa period, right? Okay, you know the Costa period was not official. It never was. That's well known now. It was not an official policy. It may have been talked about among upper class people, but it never was an official policy. So there was never a rigid class system, as it seems to be in Mexico. But on the other hand, there was a sense of a certain amount of pride in the exoticism, and this was even carried over to Europe. Even Europeans looked at the mezcla of Mexican people as exotic, right? So there was a certain amount of pride among the people about that. Now there was also the whole thing of conquest psychology, in which, in a sense, they wanted to be more like the conqueror. So there's all this desire to be other than what you are, to be like the Europeans, and we see this even today, although some of that's changing. Very difficult questions, very complex in Mexico. Here it's not complex at all. They didn't want to have anything to do with Indians. And slavery was specifically property. Now Indians mixed with them. The Seminole Indians, many of the Indians escaped into Florida, and one of the great chiefs of the Seminole Indians was black. There was no problem with that. Among the Cherokees, there was a mix. For the most part, there was no feeling among Native Americans between black Africans and themselves. But the Euro Americans was a whole different thing. In fact, Andrew Jackson fought in the Seminole Wars, right, against the Indians who wanted to wipe them out, and partly because there were so many escaped slaves there among the Seminoles.
I have to apologize for this slide because it's pretty pretty tough to look at. I'm sorry for anybody, but I thought it was relevant because, to your point, there were a lot of African slaves in Mexico.
Yeah.
And so that had bad things going on, and then there was also the phenomenon of the widespread Afro mestizo.
Yeah, this is Costas paintings. They're really interesting. And often, I don't see some of the better pictures I've seen there. They often show one of the upper classes with his woman and child. Were real, and they had various names for them. If you're familiar with it, they had various interesting names. But again, you got to understand this was never official policy. It never was official policy in Mexico. So there never was a rigid class system there. This is really interesting. This is resistance again, right? Of course, you know who this is, and you know who this is.
No,
And,
don't explain.
well, of course, this is our great mother goddess, right? You have the original.
No, I
Okay.
just
The original one, which was found at the base of the Great Pyramid when they were excavating it. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. Is really horrific. Here she's looked at much more gently. She is the mother goddess of Mexico, and the Virgin of Guadalupe, of course, occurs actually at Tepeyac, the mountain, where her shrine was. So Indians recognize the symbolism in Virgin Guadalupe painting and recognize her as Indian. They didn't see her at all. So while the Spaniards used her to bring them to Christianity, the Indians syncretized it with their own beliefs and feelings. So, and interesting enough, the painters used symbolism that the Indians understood. They knew this was an Indian woman. I mean, she's painted as an Indian. The symbolism on the shawl and on her dress, Native American flowers and plants that were sacred. You know, all this stuff was very familiar to them, and they saw it totally different than the Spanish and Mexicans later saw it.
we have to pick it up.
Pardon?
We have to pick up the pace.
Okay.
So this is further along in the colonization, the 13 colonies to the west. A lot of battles were going on that we're going to talk about, and at this time, France still had the Louisiana Middle west of there. 1803 was the Louisiana Purchase, and that, you know, people know about Napoleon, right? And France, who also had a slave system in Haiti. There was, you want to talk about this guy here?
Oh, who's this?
This is the expansion they were going into, right? And they ran up into this guy here.
Oh, Tecumseh.
Real quick.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, of course. I guess you all know Tecumseh. He was well educated, by the way. He had a brother who was a holy man also. Basically, from all the incursions that were, he united the various tribes.
But this is part of the struggle during one of the later battles when he was trying to build a coalition of tribes down to the south, and he was met with a lot of resistance. You know, they were saying, "Hey, wait, the white man's taking care of us, right? We can trust him and everything." And you know, Tecumseh saying, "Nah, I don't think so. I mean, they killed my father. You know, I mean, we've been having a lot of battles around the Great Lakes and everything." So he was actually having a hard time at that one state. He did eventually get, I think it was Creek that helped, you know, in the next round of battles. But this is kind of the dialogue that was going on.
Yeah, again, recognize that these people were very sophisticated. Federation was not a new thing to them. They understood politics.
Tecumseh had actually started a what the heck was the name of that city? It was Portstown or something like that. And it was a trans-tribal community that they built. It was an entire city of multiple tribes, and from that base of operation, they were launching resistance. But it was also attacked when one of the U.S. military leaders found out that he was down south trying to build a coalition. He knew he was away, and that's when they launched an attack. But there were other signs of unity, like, and you can talk about the Iroquois Federation briefly, Peter.
Well, of course, you know about the Iroquois Confederation and how it came about. These people were fighting not about hunting rights and gathering rights, but not in the sense of fighting for property. They never saw that. The earth was stuff that you honored, and you honored the animals as much as you did the other people there. So often their battles were not real battles, but were symbolic battles. But they did have a constant battles going on there between various tribes along that coast, and ultimately a man who didn't speak very well came to. He's called the Great Peacemaker. He has a name, but I can't think of it right now. And he started talking to somebody who later on became known as Hiawatha, right? But he convinced him to go to the various tribes that were fighting and tell them about how they can bring peace to this region of the area, and they did. They created a federation. This is a base for American democracy and the Constitution. This is where all the Europeans who knew about democracy and thought it came from the Greeks actually came from here. Everything that I was studying for, occurred right here. This is where it came from.
One slight problem, obviously, they did not consider indigenous people or Africans human beings. Minor detail.
Who did?
Europeans.
Pardon?
We're not in the Constitution.
Oh, right. No, yeah. Well, the Europeans primarily took, or Euro-Americans took, and that was Franklin and everybody else. They primarily used the Greek and the Constitution of Athens, which we know that wasn't real democracy. It wasn't true democracy at that time, and they did have real slavery in those places. Whereas the Iroquois didn't. They didn't have any of those things. Everything that you heard about as it coming from European background isn't true. What happened was that Ben Franklin and the guy by the name of Morgan, who also influenced Marx, sent their writings to Europe. Those guys, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, all these people took these ideas and they developed the idea of the noble savage and the man in the state of nature. And these ideas came back to America. And they created what they call democracy here. But it wasn't true, right? I mean, what they did wasn't for real.
Democracy for whom?
Yeah.
So the one thing about this dense history is you got to remember there's all this settler colonialism from different European countries happening at the same time, right? Overlapping. So while the Iroquois and the 5 tribes and eventually 6 were banding together, and then all of these wars, there were like different tribes that sided with the British, some tribes sided with the Americans, but there was it was a permanent state of war, kind of like how the U.S. is now, right? No difference, right? So in Haiti, there was a slave rebellion brewing, right? And Napoleon was still trying to hang on to the territory there, and I think he ran into some trouble in a couple of other battles, and the slave rebellion in Haiti was part of the reason why they just kind of had to decide, hey, we can't deal with this, you know what I mean? So Napoleon says, okay, I'm out of here, right? So it's a funny thing what revolution does to the colonizers. So this is a continued ideology of the times, manifest destiny, the Monroe Doctrine, and it was sort of this U.S. version of the Crusades, basically, right? All the justification, religious kind of framing to justify ongoing genocide.
Yeah, Manifest Destiny was originally put forward by a journalist, and of course, British, I guess, at the time, because it was 1903, I think, somewhere around there. And he basically he was justifying eliminating all the Indians. I mean, they really wanted to get rid of them. So he lent a religious fervor to the whole idea of doing that. And in I think it was in 1830, it became official U.S. policy.
So this is a fundamental thing that there's no documentation anywhere in any of the indigenous cultures. We're not trying to paint some kind of idealized thing that everybody got along all the time. You know what I mean? There was conflict. There's competition on resources. If you had a good fishing hole, you didn't want to give that up. Like you might have to walk another 40 miles to get the fishing hole. So there was kind of things like that, but there's no record of any indication that the level of dehumanization, absolute dehumanization. I mean, they did not consider African people as human beings. They did not consider indigenous people as human beings. And I think it's pretty clear you can see that kind of same disregard for people's humanity to this day in this country, right? It's pretty obvious. Peter already mentioned this. I'm not going to let him keep talking about it because we're going to get time. So eventually, Tecumseh actually did lose a major battle. You know, it was a heroic battle, but he got shot to death. But it should be noted, Tecumseh is the number one reason why there is a Canada. If it wasn't for Tecumseh and the coalition that he built, also including with the British, which at the time inspired some of the Canadian militias to resist the U.S. incursion into Canada, there might not be a Canada. Thomas Jefferson at one point said, Canada is going to be such a piece of cake, all we need to do is march over there and we'll take it. But because of the resistance that Tecumseh levied around that middle Great Lakes area, that didn't happen. So props to Tecumseh.
Yeah, remember that's the French Canadians. And French Canada was a little bit different from the British part of Canada.
Yeah.
So they accepted the Indians in a different way.
So the U.S. There was an earlier slide here, but the U.S. continues its march forward, Monroe Doctrine, and all
You
this
want to
stuff.
mention Baton Rouge?
Huh?
Kind of interesting.
If you want, but not too long because we're running behind.
I always wondered about Baton Rouge. It was actually they were actually Cree, and they fought against the Americans, primarily because the settlers were taking over their land. And of course, they gave them some land, but of course they wanted it all. So the Baton Rouge, or Red Sticks as they were known, fought them off. So resistance was going on all the time. We don't hear about it, but there was a lot of different points of resistance everywhere.
So this is tribes in California. And now, of course, we talked a little about the French and Napoleon. This is obviously the missionaries in Spain. And this is a picture of the tribe, the Kumite tribe in San Diego, right? Not too far from here, south of here. And the Spaniard militia were enslaving the women and treating them horribly. And they made the father of that mission pay the price. So after Mexican declared independence, or won independence after a series of years, 1820 21, they kind of basically took over the territory that we're in right now in Spain. So we're going to transition to the continued west expansion. President Polk staged a kind of a bogus war at the Alamo, and then he didn't expect to win it, but he just wanted, it was kind of like a Pearl Harbor kind of thing, right? Staged the war, claimed that you were attacked, gaslight everybody, right? Go back to Congress, say, hey, we can't have this, right? And then that later led to the Battle of San Jacinto, and the U.S. won. Mexican government was having a lot of internal contradictions at that point, and eventually they ceded what was, I think, was nearly half of the total Mexican territory. I mean, they lost that whole area up there, right, to the U.S., and that was basically the Treaty of Guadalupe, right?
There were a lot of pressures. That all had to do with manifest destiny, of course.
Yes. And don't forget, all this time, we still have slavery in the South, right? Texas was the last slave state, and also we started having the gold rush at the same time, the exact same time.
By the way, that's Texas Juneteenth, right? Y'all know about Juneteenth.
So while this was happening, like the Lewis and Clark expedition, for example, which was basically a reconnaissance trip to the west to try to, lay the grounds for how to attack the west, happened at the same time as the Louisiana Purchase, right about the same time. So wrapping it up, basically want to get into the fact that hopefully what we can start getting people to understand is that the indigenous people were fighting from the get-go, from day one, and really encourage people to look into that. It's pretty inspiring. what they were doing, and it's still continuing today, even though the idea that there was genocide, yes, there was genocide. A lot of people did get wiped out, lost a lot of the culture, lost a lot of the languages, lost the land, obviously, lost all political power. There are tremendous disparities, in everything that people face in the reservations. The law system of laws, right? Like people should look at the Marshall Trilogy, major cases that basically, you know, had the legal system set up to not allow indigenous people to have any control over land. The first incursions into New Mexico by the book that Midnight Books reprinted on the Chicano National Question out of New Mexico. Read that book; it's great. It has a lot of sightings of the Mexican peasantry rebellion as well as the indigenous people. But the main incursion in New Mexico was mostly lawyers, and they were pitting up the legal system, for to take away land. So it's all about land. So in reverse, that's why we're having this workshop to talk about that. This is a really horrible situation that people might have heard of the missing and murdered indigenous women. We need to figure out how to plug into that and put a stop to this horrific thing. Two, land struggles, Apache stronghold. Republicans, John McCain was involved with it. Another Republican sold off some sacred land, Apache land, to Australian miners who had already had a track record of encroaching upon sacred lands, indigenous lands in Australia, right? So now they're doing the same thing on Apache land. Oxfam, same thing. There's a Lithium Americas Corporation that's destroying that land over there.
It's poison.
Yeah, poison also. There's a new movement. Concept is land back, right? Let's return stewardship back to the indigenous people. I mean, Peter and I just went to a talk by some of the kids, Gabrielinos. The knowledge they have is just incredible. I mean, they have knowledge of all the local plant life. They have knowledge of the water table.
It's all oral too.
It's all oral. They have knowledge of how nature has natural filtration processes to remove toxins, and how this cordoning of natural water flow by cement is like totally screwing up the natural process of nature. So we want to put indigenous people back at the front of the table to help with our land planning. They have in the knowledge based upon generations how to manage the land, and we have to center that. We're going to get out of this mess, as opposed to the rape of the land, the destruction of the land, the chemicals, poisoning the land, right? We need to completely reverse that. This is what we're talking about, centering indigenous people.
Yeah, let me just say real quick that in terms of resistance, it's going on constantly. And the interesting thing about that resistance, and it's all across from the tip of South America to Alaska, all the way up to Alaska, right? But the big thing about it, that we hear about these things like the death of the indigenous, the deaths and murder of indigenous women, it disappears. It's erased. We hear about it and it goes away, And there's a real problem with that. That's what we have to overcome. That's what we have to recognize is a post-colonial imposition on our thing. That we have, because of the concepts that are imposed on us, we have gone along with that whole disappearance thing. We don't recognize it, we don't see it, or we just ignore it once we hear about it. So that's a big thing, that whole idea of disappearance.
As much as I love Midnight Books, we shouldn't have to be relying on education happening in only the small, spaces, right? It should be integral to the public education. There's so much that we didn't even start covering, in the short talk tonight. Leonard Peltier, people know about this case. Still ongoing. I'm never going to forgive Barack Obama for not pardoning him when he had the chance to, but we still got to keep pushing for our
If
program.
nobody has read Matheson's book, you should take a look at it. That's in the spirit of praise course, and it deals with everything the American government, and they actually censored this book for I forget how many years. They didn't allow it to be published specifically because they didn't want people to know about what was going on.
Sacred sites, they're everywhere, right? Sacred sites are critical in terms of honoring the spiritual component of indigenous people relative to the planet again. There's a reason for these spiritual sites, and there's a reason for these practices, right? It's to honor the Mother Earth and respect it. They're everywhere, and there's, everybody knows about redevelopment, gentrification in all of our communities, right? They're not respecting the land. They're not respecting the sacred sites. The oil companies, corporations, Standing Rock, all of this stuff, right? We need to keep fighting that.
By the way, there are laws in California to protect the sacred sites, but you know how politics is. Whatever they can opportunistically use, they use, and they find loopholes all the time. And they've done that here.
One of my favorites, take a stand on the side of indigenous plants and animals, right? My cousin, God bless him, he likes to take photos. He's a really good photographer, right? And he had a post on Facebook of this beautiful, vibrant orange and yellow flower, and he had a bee on it, and he worked the focus. It was a great shot. And I kind of passive aggressively posted a link to an article about the monarch butterflies, right? The problem, and I've learned this from the community garden people in El Sereno. Support community gardens, by the way, but they taught me, and Peter helped me with this too, because Peter's into gardening. The European milkweed is a perennial. That means it flowers during the wintertime. Butterflies, they go after the flowers that have pollen, just like the bees do, right? If they see some access to getting pollen in the wintertime, they're not going to keep flying south with that like they're supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
So see what's that doing to the monarch population and the ecology. But Home Depot says, oh man, people buy the colorful plant. They like to have the yards look good, right? Colonizers do what they want to do with the land. They don't respect the indigenous land. Oh, I just want to satisfy my personal aesthetic sensibilities. You know what I mean? In my wonderful backyard with my nice patio furniture and everything, right? Entertain my friends with Chardonnay. You know what I mean? They're killing the monarch butterflies. Why plant this European foreign colonizer milkweed when there are there's 2 varieties that'll grow in LA alone, right? There's separate varieties for northern LA. There's separate varieties for Orange County. There's separate varieties for San Diego. Do some damn homework and help the monarchs do their thing.
I do have a native milkweed growing in my yard, and I have seen monarchs in my yard. So that's some real hope.
But not in the winter.
They are coming back. They are coming back little by little.
Things like this, I mentioned that there's a lot of disparity in healthcare. We need to take a stand on reform efforts that benefit everybody, especially those that face healthcare disparity. And there's a campaign right now, as you know, Bernie Sanders ran on Medicare for All, won California primary in 2020. There's another guy named Cornel West. He's trying to lift up that issue right now. There's also neoliberal forces that are opposing it by pushing legislation that benefits the private insurers, which are the reason why we have all these problems and people are getting killed by the healthcare industry because it's monetizing our healthcare for private profit, right? And that's bill called SB 770 right now. It's in suspension in the Assembly Appropriations Bill. We want you to call your Assembly people that are in that committee and tell them to keep it in suspension. Do not vote to release that into a hearing. We don't need to advance it. We need to focus on Medicare for All. In California, that's CalCare. And nationally, there's still also Medicare for All motion going on. Thank you. That's it for our presentation point. I want to move it into discussion. Basic community agreements. We're all in this together. Nobody has an answer. It's very complicated. We're only talking about locally, and it's hard enough that way, but globally, it's even way more complicated than that. So community agreements are real basic. Share the space. Don't hog the mic, don't hog the time, and let's allow each other to share our opinions. Everybody's opinion matters. Everybody's life experience has value. We don't have to agree on everything. Even if we disagree, I'd rather have your opinion than hear no opinion. Because even in our disagreement, you might give me a point of view that I never considered because you have a different life experience, right? So that's about it. Here's some questions that we can consider. But it's open mic time. Anybody want to have comments?
I feel like I'm pretty loud by myself.
Go ahead.
So something I just hello. It's not even on. Oh, there we go. All right. Hold this way for me. Something that was in my head since you guys were talking about monarch butterfly populations. I've been getting really into native plants and taking like a native plant course right now. And something I discovered recently is that moths actually do like 70% of pollination. Yeah, moth populations are hugely important. So keeping that in mind, I'm trying to plant native plants, and I'm trying to keep the moths in mind. What do they like to sip on?
MOTH moths.
Yeah.
Different moths. Yeah, I'm not a moth expert. I don't know, Peter.
There are a lot of plants that are night blooming, and moths are attracted, and those plants usually have a really strong sweet odor, and those are the plants that are specific to certain moths. But they also pollinate other plants too, but primarily night blooming plants, and there are actually quite a few of them.
I love it. I love it. I'm learning so much, and I feel like everything I'm learning is reaffirming the fact that we are from nature, and nature is our food, our home, that there's so much power in this knowledge. So, yeah, thank y'all.
By the way, the woman that was going to, she'll be at the next one. She's an expert on native plants. I mean, and it's all oral. So much so I didn't realize she was at the what's the name of the museum again? The Huntington Library, right? You know, they've got the gardens there, right? Well, primarily native plants. She wrote a book on how those native plants are used. That's how our knowledge is. She's just absolutely incredible.
Can't wait to catch that.
Do you remember the name of the website? Native Roots.
Native roots, right?
No, it was another. It had another word.
I can't remember.
Any other feedback and comments? Anybody? Everybody.
So thank you both. Really interesting to think about. I mean, you went through the entire continent, and I think that's really what we need. Like you were saying, you know, like this should be something that we all know. And I mean, like you said, Taiji, like thankfully now we're discussing it here. You know, thanks to Midnight Books and Gabe and this incredible space. And it's something that we need to, you know, keep on going. I feel like this is amazing, just the whole process of thinking about it, and that's why we should continue to support. So I guess I wanted to say, make sure you're supporting Midnight Books, eh? Get a book if you can at the end, yes. But because we want to keep this going.
Yeah.
But I was really personally intrigued by the first part where we were going over the different groups in Mexico. I know I am Mexican, like I was born over there, and I'm from the neighboring group, the Purépechas. So I think it's just fascinating that, I think, you know, since I was born there and I went in elementary school there, it's just so different. You know, there is more respect for the indigenous heritage of Mexico than there certainly is here for the indigenous people here. And in Mexico, I think we get a lot more experience with it and a lot more affiliations with it. And it's so sad to me that say people from Mexican heritage, but from any country, maybe they've been here for several generations, just they don't know. And so I think we have to do some type of better, some type of research, right? Like, where are we coming from? Because I think that's, what you were saying at the beginning. It's like, how do we fix all these problems that we have? Well, part of it is understanding where we're coming from so that we can, think about how the struggle has been going on for hundreds, thousands of years, and how we are now coming into it. And I'm just fascinated by, all of the quote immigrants, say from Mexico, that are here. Where are we from Mexico from, and like what is that history, and how do we inform our current efforts? So I would love to, if you have any suggestions, just researching that stuff.
Yeah,
I don't
that's one
know.
of the things that Teresa is involved in, and along with a bunch of other Indians. But let me just suggest something to you. That in 1950s, late 1950s and early 1960s, the Bureau of Indian Affairs had a real problem. They had to give back money they'd been stealing, right? And how they were going to do that, they had to determine who was Native American, right, on this side of the border. How to do that, and they finally determined the genealogy, ultimately reducing the blood, right? So who had the most pure blood in the United States, right? Guess what? They determined that the highest percentage of Native American blood in the United States was Mexican Americans. Mexican Americans. the mestizaje is real. The next group that had a high percentage of Native American blood was Navajo, because they tend not to marry outside of Navajo. They do have something rules against incest, but it's not blood. It is. It has to do with which group you belong to in Navajo. In Navajo, there's different groups, and if you can't marry within your own group, and that's called incest to them. But it doesn't have anything to do with consanguinity. There are other groups that are high, but none of them come close to what Mexican Americans came to. So they were caught with a real problem. It was a very, very serious problem. And by the way, Taiji just showed me some recent research. What university was it from?
Which one?
Or the one that talks about that Native Americans, the highest percentage of Native Americans in the United States.
Right. It was actually a business site. It was like.
Oh, was it really?
Yeah, it was interesting. The one that had the Mexican indigenous one, right? And we had to have the conversation about.
Again, it's for lack of a better term, I'll use the term Latin Americans that have moved to the United States are the highest percentage of native blood.
Yeah. So I had a Navajo. They had this Mexican / indigenous mestizo mixture, which would include Chicanos, but it also included, in other words, it included like Mexican with indigenous lineage that were trapped on this side of the border after annexation, right? And then, but it also included other indigenous people. So that big mixed block of people was the highest number of.
It gets very complicated, because people recognize themselves in different ways. You know, like people from a lot of the Southwest they were there forever. They do not recognize themselves as Mexican Americans. You know, they're from the Southwest, and they were always there. And it's true, there were no borders at one time. On the other hand, there's another problem, because when the Spaniards invaded the Southwest, right, they fought with local Indians, right, and they resisted them. The Indians did resist them. So there's always been animosity between a lot of Southwestern nations and Mexicans. So it gets really, really deep and complicated. So post-colonial impositions are heavy, really heavy.
Hi, great lecture. I noticed that some people, when they want to gaslight indigenous people, and this includes some Asians, they're going to bring up that Bering Strait theory. How do you respond to it?
Me?
Anybody, because you Peter, or you
Anybody,
Taji.
let other people.
Oh, yeah.
They're spokesmen. Other people continue. How did they say it? Go ahead.
I guess like kind of like adding to that question is that like when because like we like categorize people, and then there was the category that's the Asian American Pacific Islander. But then in my mind, it's like the Pacific Islanders also, like their land is often more occupied. And we talk about like all of these, oh Lord, these like we need to disaggregate like the data, even like within like Asian Americans, there are like so many differences. Also like Pacific Islanders being so different from Asian Americans, and then it's like a whole thing. So I guess just like add to that question, like how do we respond and how do we make sense of all of this mess?
I don't think anybody has answers. I mean, that's the whole problem. You know what I mean? That's what we're trying to do. Like John and I were talking about, this affirmative action stuff. I mean, Asian Americans, whatever the hell that is, and my contention is nobody knows what the hell that is. I mean, I could fit into that category, but I'm pretty damn sure whoever wrote that article doesn't know who I am. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know where most Bangla people live. I don't know the genesis of why there's so many in New York City. You know what I mean? Like, why is Cambodia Town in Long Beach still the largest Khmer population outside of Cambodia? Who understands that, right? When we had the Code Pink event, right? And we were talking about a particular sector of Chinese in San Gabriel Valley. That's only one sector of, we were talking about post-1965 immigrants, but there's a whole nother slew of Taiwanese. There's Cantonese that go all the way back to the mid 1800s, right? There's, you know what I mean? So it's like, I think that we need to start investigating things more.
Yeah, I might say real quick. Oh, I didn't agree. No, I was just gonna say that there's something that was about a concept called the brother stranger syndrome, which kind of explains how people reject accepting other people. If the brother stranger syndrome basically says that if you're my people, I accept you, but other people are not. You know, so that's almost universal. It had a very special meaning within Native Americans here, and it probably did in other countries too. In Africa, it could be pretty bloody, but it exists everywhere.
I guess having grown up in like the anti-imperialist Korean left, like grew up like both of them. When we think about expelling U.S. from Korea, we're still assuming the U.S. will exist, and I was wondering if we could change that messaging to, because our thing is like get out of Korea, leave us alone. But maybe if centering indigenous voices means the U.S. straight up like get out, like don't exist anymore. So I was wondering if there's ways to continue the conversation to help bridge the anti-imperialist activism overseas with the conversations having here.
Yeah. You know, the Okinawan people have the same problem.
Yeah.
And they're really resisting too.
Yeah.
And this is happening everywhere. You know.
I don't know, sort of a straw poll question regarding sovereignty. Okay, so, and this has already sort of been decided, but I'm just going to throw it as a theoretical. Like, let's say there's an effort to organize a labor union at an Indian casino. And let's say the casino management say, we don't want the labor union here. We're declaring our sovereignty is a lot stronger than y'all think it is, and we want to kick the labor union out of here. What's the position to take as a left-wing, red kind of person? Just wondering. So I don't know.
Isn't it fun that we're coming up with more questions than answers? Yeah, I mean, I think this is part of the process, right?
Yeah.
Anybody want to take a stab at it?
Oh, I actually had a question.
Oh,
No, I mean, like, in relation to what this is bringing up right here and what y'all brought up earlier as far as, like, how you can't really apply, like, white supremacist ideology, whether it's, like, you know, with capitalism or, like, certain forms of ML. Because, like, so what you brought up kind of reminds me, have y'all heard of this person called Twin Rabbit? There's, like, this podcast, but they were kind of, you familiar with it?
I've heard of it, I haven't.
Oh, okay. He kind of had an interesting breakdown as far as like what y'all brought up as far as like how the Europeans co-opted a lot of indigenous cultures, and then like that's how you came with an old savage. And then for some reason it could kind of made me think about like y'all ever think about how like the whole concept of like socialism, like from like a European standpoint, was like a misinterpretation of like what indigenous practices were and stuff. And then so what y'all are trying to present is what y'all are trying to present is like, if we're trying to explore like revolution, we should try to go back to what our culture would be, right? So for y'all, it'd be like indigenous. What that mean for like Asian people, like for myself, would be like re-exploring Taoism or Buddhism. Or
that's
yeah.
that's up to you. I mean, you know, I personally feel like this whole thing about, you know, how they say if you're gonna make, for example, socialism, it has to be based on the conditions of where you live, right?
Yeah.
Every country is different. I mean, we're not going to have a Bolshevik revolution in the United States. I mean, it doesn't work like that. Yeah, sorry. Some people might try, but there are people that try, right? Or it's not going to be like China. You know?
You can't have a mouth revolution.
There's 5 million opinions about China right now, but it's like, you know, we're not in the position to really say. I mean, and I say around the Asian American thing, John and I were talking about, we should just go around to what Rodolfo was saying, like, we need to just start interviewing our people. Like, who are you? Where did you come from? Why are you here? You know, what's your family's background? and just start doing that kind of research. Go back to Mexico and ask, you know,
Yeah,
about the
I
history.
think your identity is dependent on who you identify with. That's who your identity is.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, lots of great.
Whoa, man!
You okay?
I'm alive. It's on video. I'm alive. Sorry. Sorry to interrupt you.
So yeah, I just wanted to go back to a question. Because just so I'm understanding, so is there so people are saying I'm that they're not anti-indigenous because they have shared genetics? Is that what's happening?
No, it's more like when indigenous people, I notice, and like, sorry, Rodolfo. Okay, so I noticed in like social media forums, you know, we talk if somebody brings about the indigenous people, some like either a white person is gonna say like, oh well, you know, your people came here from the Bering Strait, you people came here from Asia, you know, so you're, you know, so I guess they're trying to like say, well, you're not even the first people, you're not the people of this land, you're not the people of Turtle Island, you know, and it's just so much gaslighting. And then I just noticed an Asian dude that I know, and I want to talk to him about it. Like, he mentioned the Bering Strait theory, and I just want to tell him, I mean, I've heard of a lot of other theories saying that Native, you know, that the indigenous were always here, or they were here a lot earlier than you think they were, you know. But it seems like for some reason the Bering Strait theory seems to stick. Even though I think there's been other theories unearthed since then. Am I correct?
They talked about it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, but for some reason, the Bering Strait one is sticking. But I do know other indigenous activists who are going to point out, like, no, we have a lot of other evidence pointing the indigenous people were here a lot earlier. And not only that, if you notice, like, I've noticed a lot of indigenous people don't look anything like Asians, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, all you have to do is just take a little trip to Mexico and you're going to notice it, you know? You'll also notice some other things. I used to live up in Northern California, and they were talking about the indigenous people that used to live up there and that they suddenly so-called disappeared. And they were talking about their practices, like cooking outdoors and that sort of thing. And they were explaining it to this Mexican lady who, you know, she was from Mexico, and she was hearing, she got really happy. She goes, oh, wow, we do that too. We do, you know, we still do that back on the ranch, you know? And it's like, so it's like, do you know what this means? You know? I mean, come on. I mean, you know, it's kind of obvious. It's obvious the indigenous people were always here. You know, I mean, those indigenous practices, like you said, disappeared and died out. They're still being used in like Mexico, and they're still being used, you know, I don't know. It's like we're always taught like, oh, these indigenous people just disappeared. And it's like, maybe they just kept things on the low. I don't know. And they're still doing it, you know, they're still doing their thing. And, you know, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, right.
I would have
Yeah.
a way to counter it if that comes up.
Pass the mic back.
Oh, sorry. So I'm like extremely Korean, but this is how I would counter it. It's like Koreans migrated from Kazakhstan through Siberia and Mongolia to Korea. So, but we would not call ourselves Kazakh culture. We're Koreans, you know? So I think like,
Wow.
yeah, I think migration is, unless you're literally from Kazakhstan, like you will have some sort of history of migration and cultures changing. So if people are literally like, because you migrated from somewhere, you're from there, I think that makes no sense, because then I would have to say I'm Kazakhstan. Like,
Yeah.
We're actually all African here.
Right. Yeah. Oldest humans, sub-Saharan originally, it's the oldest one we found so far.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like the question is like that important. I think indigenous people just being some caregivers and there being no history of them genociding the people when they got here, you know, like I think the colonial method was really something that was really unique, and you know, the uniqueness of the indigenous people and preserving the paradise that you know, the Americas is more significant than, you know, what happened when they came and if they came. Or
Yeah, thank you.
Just kind of put that
Can I go back? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I want to go back to John's question real quick. I think you brought it up. It's really complex because, again, the post-colonial system has created a big divide between traditional Native Americans and the casino people. There's battles going on. I knew people in the Marengo casino and people from there, and they do not get along at all. They do not agree at all. And of course the money is controlled primarily by not Indian people. I mean, it's corporations that come in, and they do have councils of people that they want this of Native Americans. So among the traditional peoples, there's just a lot of disagreement. So again, it's a post-colonial thing. Makes all those questions that you were asking very difficult.
I mean, I think the issue also, John, is what is your class status? I'm not gonna support exploitation of workers just because you're indigenous. If you're indigenous capitalist, I'm personally, that's just my position. I'm gonna stay with my class. You know what I mean? I don't believe in exploitation of labor, right? For personal gain. So, I mean, that's just the way it is. I'm gonna side with the casino owners if there's an Australian mining company coming onto their indigenous sacred land and destroying it. I'm in complete agreement with that. But if I'm a casino worker and I can't pay my bills, that's the stance I'm going to take, is to get paid for my labor. I don't think it's that complicated myself.
I think it is complicated.
I mean, it is, but that's my position.
Yeah.
You're right, but
I mean, I tend to agree with you too. However, as issues of sovereignty get larger, and hopefully they will get larger, sovereignty is going to become one of the more base principles that you have to base your decisions on, and it's going to make it more difficult. And I think this is one of these things that these I don't know what to call it really, but it's these situations that will come up. It already has come up with the casinos, but that's considering that's all they got. That's the only large source of money out there. And so I do tend to be well, okay, you got to look at the situation in some detail. There isn't a simple answer anymore, right? So that's how I think of it right now. And I feel like it will get more complicated as there is some land being given to different tribes. However, the specific conditions of land being given is all kind of tricky too, and it's a whole other thing to talk about. But yeah, as there's more land involved, more capital involved, right, and more of a push for sovereignty, that this will become more of an issue. And I feel like as people of the left who might be involved in these situations, we have to be conscious of this and maybe not. I don't want to say be class reductionist, but don't be class reductionist. And so that's my take on it.
What about class reductions? Want to break down again? Sorry.
That you would say, okay, class will override sovereignty.
Oh,
class
yeah.
will override, like various indigenous issues that will come up, whether it be membership in tribe or whatever.
Oh,
Or if there's even say a casino has some kind of affirmative action type program for their own people.
yeah.
I mean, shouldn't they be able to do that?
Okay.
Well, I think what John is bringing up is the national question here in the U.S. Basically is, something and it's probably a Twitter thing, but patriotic socialist. Isn't this the thing? I mean, they are basically what they call themselves communists. But yeah, but what they're saying is basically it's going to be communism, but it's going to be primarily by the white people on this land. So it's like saying, well, we'll have in this scenario, we'll have communists, but there still won't be any sovereignty for the indigenous people. So is that better? That's the question.
Well, the interesting thing, of course, is that Native Americans do have sovereignty. That's why these corporations can come in and say, hey, we see an opportunity here to make money. You got sovereignty. I can put a money-making thing in here. We'll take advantage of that sovereignty,
But is
which
it?
they've been able to
But
do.
is it? I'm sorry. But is it the? It's like here, right? You'll have like the business people. They can make the decisions. But what about the actual people?
Yeah, that's a whole other problem.
So that's what I'm saying. So I'm assuming it's the same thing on
Yeah.
for the indigenous nations. Is the people in the casino owners. Some of them probably are indigenous, but they are capitalist indigenous.
Exactly.
But what about the people?
Yeah.
So,
Was anyone else on cue?
I have like a kind of practical question, but if we were doing land back here, who would we like? What would be the organization that we're demanding like we give this land back to? This one.
Sorry, I actually like that's kind of like I also have a question. I'm so sorry. It's kind of like add to you like we say land back, but then exactly like we know it's a difficult battle to fight, but what exactly would like land back look like?
Like the body, the organizational body that we're like we need to give land back to these people, and this is they're gonna govern it now.
Yeah, and then also like go back to your point, like at that point will there still be a United States? Anyway,
They've been doing, I think in NorCal, there's been some like I know like in the news recently they've been returning land to like tribes. I don't know if that's the right word.
Washington and
Washington and Central California area
Ooh.
land
and
has
some
been
and
given
some
back.
private owners have been giving back
So,
land too.
yeah. So,
And tribes have been buying land too.
oh, cool.
Yeah,
If we
especially
were
if they
doing
have
that-
casinos. Yeah, they've been doing it.
If we're doing that here, who should we be directing the energy to be doing land back for real?
You know, it's a real question. Like in Washington, apparently it's conservative people who have given the land back. The interesting thing about that, of course, when they give something away, it's tax-free. I mean, they get tax benefits for it, right? Peter Strauss gave a whole bunch of land, that was Indian land, but he gave it to the county, I believe. Whenever wealthy people give, they get. They don't do nothing for free, right? So I'm not sure what happened up there. The rancher that gave away land here in central California area, he actually gave it away. He gave it away. The Irvines gave away land too. Guess what? They're extremely wealthy. They don't pay any taxes, and they got more tax benefits on that. Things. So this is a real curious thing.
Oh, I just wanted to add on to that. I don't know if anybody heard, there was some more recent news. A lady, she gave, I guess, and she comes from a well-to-do family too, of course. They recently gave like some of their property in Altadena back to the Tongva. Yeah.
I don't know about that.
Oh, okay. But
That's a real curious thing because you might want to talk about that.
No, I don't want to.
she's a burner too, I think.
With talk around casinos and stuff, or maybe it's just some of my background in history, but had anyone thought about the exploration around like game theory in relation to like what we're exploring as far as like what we're trying to get as far as like it's just like have you all thought about exploring what incentives to provide in order to make any gains in relation to like incentives that the state tries to provide that seems to divide indigenous tribes, it seems, right? Relating to like casinos and like resources, whatever. So I'm not sure if that's something y'all explored. Also in relation to like when y'all brought about the was it person's name? Telmuke? Did I pronounce his name right?
Tecumseh.
Tecumseh, okay. I'm just curious on like what has been explored around like the various strategies he has taken in creating it was like a federation, right? Because when I was first introduced to this guy, it was from this reading from this black socialist dude, Bill Fletcher Jr. Y'all familiar with that reading from MR Online? Okay, I'll send that to y'all later, but
I know Bill Fletcher. I don't know what reading.
okay. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just curious of like what kind of strategy y'all explore from Talmud Game's.
I mean, can I just say first of all, there's no one in this room that's going to be the center of that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
it's not anybody in this room's place to be determining what decisions should be made for Indigenous people. That's
Oh, yeah.
my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not going to really speculate. I mean, they need to figure out how to get together. I mean, I'm advocating that Indigenous people be at the front of the table for land management because in their culture, they have the practices that I believe are most consistent with the interests of the land itself. But I'm not in a position to determine specifically which tribes are at the front of the table or whether it's going to be a collection of various tribes in a region and how that's going to be worked out. But it's not, I think that's a process that has to happen amongst the Indigenous people, you know.
Let me just say real quickly that Teresa, the woman who was going to be here, Rachel is her name, one of the reasons she was come, because she stepped back. She's kind of put herself out of the public light for a while. For a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons she wants to come to speak to us is because she recognizes spirit. Because she says, she feels there's a real movement going on among people who think the way she does. And she sees us as a real hopeful group. So she wants to come and talk to us all and let her know her wisdom. Which is, we know it already. We know it. That whole idea is kind of disappeared among us, the erasure.
Can I just ask a real question? Because, like it's really easy to get in these abstractions. And John, I didn't mean to say that your question I didn't mean to denigrate it because it is very complex. You know what I mean? But I think I was just trying to speak personally that we don't have the answers, right? And so I think it's great that everybody's coming up with questions because that's part of the process. You know what I mean, right? Like, we're coming up with the questions because we're grappling with how to advance things, and we don't have to have the answers right now, right? But I just wanted to clarify when it comes to specific questions about the Indigenous people, they have to address for themselves. We're not the ones to address it for them. That's
What was the last part?
We're not the people to address those questions for Indigenous people.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Just a little bit on the land back, maybe it's maybe something that can kind of think about. I think like Indigenous caregivers of the land that have a lot of knowledge of plant life, those are the people we should be looking towards when thinking about land back. And there is some tribe we can, the low income ones I think would be really important to help and stuff. That's just something I was thinking. Maybe a kind of a common question is kind of on what you were talking about, how Tecumseh was able to unite tribes and stuff, and how the identity of the Chicano was kind of like a thing where we can kind of have a holistic identity where it did have a con to it was that you kind of erase the cultures of the indigenous peoples and their traditions by taking on that kind of larger identity. But in the positive form, it does kind of help with bringing more people into a battle where maybe an indigenous tribe has an issue and can't fight their battle, but if they unite with other tribes, it's much easier. And maybe it could just be a movement without having it be an identity, and you can keep your indigenous identity, but there is some kind of ebb and flow, cons and pros to these things that I kind of see. Some people will be like, no, don't call yourself Mexican, we're indigenous, and then I think of like the Spaniard in Mexico City that's very like fair skinned, and I'm like, well, I don't want them calling themselves indigenous. So it can get more complicated than just doing what you want.
Can I just ground it a little bit, like some of these questions? Like, what is this decolonization process? I know I've learned a lot through this process, and I hope to keep studying. But can I ask, like, how people see, or did you come up with any more ideas about how you can engage in decolonization practice? You talked about the moss and the plants and things like that. But can other people that haven't spoke can share maybe? Aaron.
What am I talking about?
How do you decolonize yourself?
How do I decolonize myself?
Or
I don't know, dude.
Or your work, or anything,
Huh?
anything. your work or anything?
Oh, my work? Well, I spend way too much time than I'm supposed to on like pre-Columbian America. I'm supposed to do like 3 days, and then this past year I did 2 weeks. Even that wasn't enough. I had to speed up at the end. And then like throughout, like I go in deep on teaching like manifest destiny, and like teaching like Native American genocide was like just like one fell swoop. It's like over hundreds of years, like little battles by little battles by little battles. And then at the end of the year, I kind of like skip the 90s to like now, and kind of like, well, the 90s to like 2015ish, and I start like do like the past 10 years, and then I talk about like BLM, and then like land back, and stuff like that to the students, because it's like somewhat relatable to them since they're like high schoolers. It's been going on like since they've been in elementary school, and I have conversations about how like genocide's still happening today, and how like we talk about like, oh, these people like they're gone and they're dead, but they're like not, they're still here. And that's what I try to do, but it's hard. It takes a lot of scaffolding, because we don't really like talk about it any other time, and we don't talk about it in like elementary or middle school. You're lucky if you get into high school. Some people scratch the surface in college, so it's difficult.
Hi. So, I'm not the most knowledgeable person about how to decolonize myself, but one of the things that just blows my mind is, okay, being manifest destiny. I mean, it was a real thing, but I just find it hard the way that people thought that way, and it's like, no, like, get that hell out of here. Yeah, so I talk to people, I talk to relatives and just different people. There are some people who say things like, "Well, why do you talk about that? All that was a long time ago. It's history, and you just gotta accept it." And what I try to make them understand is, well, yeah, all those things were a long time ago, but they're important, and those things shape the way of how things kind of are now, and a lot of things haven't changed. There's still people with that kind of that mentality is still in our society, in our civilization. And people out there still think that way, who think it's okay to overrule people and to control people in one manner or another. And it just really upsets me when I meet people who think that way. So I try not to get in arguments, but I try to say to them, try to find out why, the point of why they think that way, or they feel that way. And then if I can't convince them, I tell them, no, you're wrong. So, yeah, so it's all fascinating to me. But what do I do to try to decolonize myself, or what I do? Well, number one, I think the one best thing we can all do is educate ourselves, and I know I certainly could use a lot more education. I don't know. I guess I just try to. I just try not to adhere to every single rule out there, especially if I feel it's a rule that's just that I know is just made, because every environment, whether it's work, whatever, has their rules, and so I just don't put up with things that people tell me that my views are wrong, and then I like to tell you, well, explain to me why. I like to have people explain things to me, not just say that's the way it is. So I don't have an answer for everything, but I try to explain myself. All right. That's it.
So I'm gonna try to say this in a way that makes sense. I think what's interesting about the national question within the context of a white supremacist settler colony like the United States is that it's also a question of internationalism. So my orientation towards the Tonga Nation, for example, is an internationalist orientation because I'm not a member of the Tonga Nation. So it's important, I think, to keep that internationalist frame in mind when addressing the national question and how to act in solidarity with decolonization in a place like the United States. Because we have to remember, and I think you alluded to this earlier, that the United States is the enemy, right? And there's going to be a lot of infiltrators, liberals or red-brown fascists, who try to redeem the United States. And it's not redeemable. So I think that in terms of how do we orient ourselves towards decolonization, how do we contribute to it, how do we frame the national question, I think keeping in mind this internationalist framework is important. I don't mean to be flippant and say like the answer is revolution, but it's just an important frame, I think, to keep in mind.
Can I actually ask a clarifying question for you, and then also you? With what you were explaining as far as like how you decolonize, were you giving an example? Providing an example around like how you have like unpacked ways of communication? Is that what you were trying to provide earlier, as far as like ways you decolonize?
Something like that, but
Okay.
how do you mean like?
Just the way like how you the way you try to comprehend when a person's communicating with you, and like whenever there's a disagreement and stuff. Was that what you're trying to present, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, of course, when I'm talking to someone about what we're talking about, like history or the history of state, country, or Americas, but I just get upset if I do hear somebody say something that doesn't sound factual to me, or I just don't agree with it. Just explain yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Not everyone can explain themselves. Some people just say things and they don't know what they're talking about. That's why I said I tend to say a lot about things that I don't know a lot about.
Mm-hmm.
I said I still have a lot to be educated about, and you don't know about it. Don't say about it. Yeah.
So it sounds like you're trying to come to a place of always trying to learn and grow, right? Okay. Cool. And then with, I had a question like, what is your definition of internationalist?
Solidarity across national lines. So maintaining support for or solidarity with other national struggles. So for example, interconnections between settler colonialism in the United States and settler colonialism in Palestine, and recognizing that those are both parts of the same project, and so the United States and Israel are the same colonial aggressor in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I mean by internationalism, is maintaining support for revolutionary struggles across national boundaries.
If I could maybe add to that a little bit and just add to the general conversation here and some of the discussions going on. A really fantastic resource that I recommend is the Red Nation's book, The Red Deal, which talks a lot about land back, indigenous sovereignty, etc., through this kind of internationalist perspective. And so to get to your question earlier, they actually define land back as basically anti-imperialism on a global scale. So they say land back is about indigenous sovereignty here in quote-unquote domestic territory in North America, but it's also about ending U.S. militarism in Okinawa, in Guam, in Hawaii, in South Korea, various places. So that's how I also like to think of indigenous sovereignty, through this kind of internationalist perspective, an anti-imperialist perspective, where if we're supporting anti-imperialist struggles in places like Palestine, in places like Hawaii, we're at the same time supporting land back in places like Southern California. It's all interconnected, and kind of taking down U.S. imperialism elsewhere weakens, the structures of U.S. imperialism here as well. And also resources for more local things, I guess, because I heard that question raised. There are various kind of indigenous land trusts in Southern California that are in early formations. There's one called the Ahashiman Conservancy. Ahashiman people being just south of Tongva territory. I'm also repping Protect Pavunga, which is on the campus of Cal State Long Beach. Check out friendsofpavunga.org. So there are some various kind of small places, small things that are still forming, but places and organizations to get involved with.
JD had a thought.
Practical question. For I have comrades who live on reservations. Does that is it accurate for their struggle to be land back if they are on a reservation? Because they don't have sovereignty, autonomy, because the United States is all around them. So I was wondering if just language-wise, is it accurate to say their struggle is still land back? Because land,
Most of them aren't even on their original land. Most of them have been even moved from there, so it's not really like they have their land.
Well, they have been given reservations, and they do have sovereignty on those reservations with certain limitations.
Yeah.
For example, if somebody outside of the reservation commits a crime,
Right.
guess what?
They don't.
The legal jurisdiction of the people on the reservation don't have priority. The settler colonial system still has the legal priority. So it's kind of like, is it really sovereignty? You know what I mean? It's not really sovereignty to me, but but it's a good question.
U.S. laws are opportunistic.
I just want to add on to that. I remember speaking to somebody at Standing Rock, and they referred to reservations as POW camps.
Yeah.
JD has a.
Well, just on the word on decolonizing, and not a criticism, but just usually when I hear the word, I hear a lot of internal and knowledge acquiring, and which are abstract, but a lot of identity stuff is abstract. But how sometimes I feel we lack the materialist part where. By identifying that we're living urban lives, as in compared to maybe a pastoral or I guess indigenous way of life, which is living off the land, and how sometimes we don't make that connection in that way, and how our everyday choices of maybe even not going for a plastic bottle and refilling your water bottle. It's something very mundane, and a lot of people will say, your consumer choices are not, something that makes you, revolutionary or whatever, but they still matter, and a lot of, our materialist actions are also, something that we should recognize and understand kind of maybe not a goal as in going back to indigenous way of life, but as in understanding that is a goal, as in living closer with nature.
Gabe.
I just wanted to go back to what you said. I really liked what you all said here. But you mentioned how Palestine, free Palestine. There's a famous, I won't say his name, but there's a famous kind of left YouTuber who's very vocal about free Palestine, and he doesn't think Israel should exist, give them their land back. So somebody asked, does that mean you support land back in the United States? And he went, oh, no, that's different. Yeah, so the question is, how is that different?
Yeah.
So it keeps going back to maybe the United States just shouldn't exist, because we all agree, Palestine should be free, right, from the river to the sea, so why would it be different here,
Should I just mention quickly? So this isn't that serious, but I do wonder. So there's land. I had a question for you. Yeah, that said there's land trusts that are forming. And are there a lot, or is it
There are a few, and I think part of the issue that currently exists is that they're all separate from each other, even in the same relatively small geographical region, and they're largely kind of focused on individual sites still. So of course that's really important, but it's not necessarily like the national liberation struggle. It's very much about kind of individual sites. So like the Ahashiman Conservancy is about some wetlands areas in Orange County. Pavunga is about one site on the campus of Cal State Long Beach. Yeah. So so there are seeds, I guess, and it's kind of going to be interesting to see how they develop or not going forward.
Do they have like sovereignty though, like their own governance?
That's a really difficult question because they are not federally recognized, at least. And I don't even know what their state recognition is. I think they might have state recognition, but I think the kind of general theme that we've been talking about is that the sovereignty that a lot of nations do have, even like the Navajo Nation and how large it is, it's not necessary. It's still not an answer to the national question because it's a limited form of sovereignty. So the reservations are not an answer to the national question. It's kind of a solution that has been handed to them by the U.S. government.
Yeah, can I interject for a second? Taiji wanted to do this. I hate to really get into it, but you have to be very careful when you're talking about these areas. When you mention Tongva and some of these other areas that are being created, they're being created by people that usually have a special interest. Like Tongva is not a traditional name that was created by academics who got us certain things out of it. So there's real problems with any of these places that are being created, and they're usually private nonprofits, which should give you a clue right away. So you have to be very careful because there are very difficult things, and again, this is a post-colonial thing, and I don't really want to get into it. We may get into it in other meetings. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Terry will talk about it.
So I just wanted to, I totally resonate with that comment, and I mean, in the whole discussion, I think that yeah, like for me, the U.S. should definitely not exist. To me, it's always say the border is a constant source of just psychological like terrorism for stress for me. Like if I go to Mexico and I come back, I'm always afraid maybe because of all my political activity, maybe they won't let me back. And of course, families can't visit each other and all this stuff, so it's horrible. So I would agree with that. But on the question of the phrase quote land back, I'm struggling again with if I have any indigenous experience, it's in Mexico, and over there people are generally, some groups I think are pushing, and individuals and some groups do push for the idea of having their own land, but overwhelmingly I don't think that's the main thrust, and I think that has to do with the history of how the Mexican state and people have kind of developed from the different indigenous nations. There's kind of like a broader identity of, yes, certainly Mexicanos. So over there, it's really the lines between, there's an emphasis on flowing within, especially central Mexico. So I don't think that like I said, I'm from the Purepecha, if you want to get technical. So I don't think that the Purepecha are pushing for land back in any way. So I think it's interesting I wonder, should the land, perhaps especially in some cases, be owned by some things like nonprofits, or should it just be declared no one owns the land? And maybe that's a little bit too far, but no borders would be kind of the conditions from the maps from before.
The ejidos were traditional lands granted by Mexico, you know that, and the Zapatista. And the Zapatista movement advocated that. Those were Native American lands. So they still advocate for it. So people do.
Right.
But that's a very traditional and very long history of it too.
Yes. Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. That's what I had in mind. Like, so some groups definitely do. I'm just pointing out that I don't think that, at least in Mexico, the vast majority of groups, I don't think they do.
I love that line of questioning and what you're getting into. And I think it might be important to note that reservations only exist in the United States and Canada.
Yes, exactly.
And other places, the people they stayed in their land.
Mhm.
Places that could be defended or that the colonists didn't want, they're still there. So that's kind of important to think about. But I love the idea that it's not necessarily about the land itself, or, I mean, we're all going to be affected by how we decide to come together, how we govern, what agreements we have. So I think it's important for us to all consider this and how we can just live right and sustainably with each other and with the earth.
Right.
Okay, it's like we're at 2 hours, so probably want to wrap it up. I did want to offer the question of, we cited many actual struggles going on right now. Have people in this room done anything to connect with those actual struggles right now? And is there any ideas about how we can start lifting those fights up more?
Yeah, I was thinking about around in relation to what this person had just shared earlier, in like transforming the legacy of colonization and patriarchy. The indigenous ancestors are calling us to do. I feel like past over years, I have had the privilege of connecting with a lot of queer comrades that have helped process and further understand what true, or quote unquote true Viet person can exist as, based on what I've learned from them. And in relation to that, I feel like the involvement with this Southeast Asian men's masculine healing group called Man Forward, I feel like combating the white male supremacy that exists in our society and also inside ourselves is a constant struggle. Something to kind of think about, I think, and still think. That's it. Thank you.
I've been learning a bit of politics from an anthropologist lately, and he speaks of how a lot of hierarchy and patriarchy was actually like instilled, brought upon people through scarcity. You know, like sometimes it's our materialist conditions that require that, because some people were already somewhere or whatever. So just I think bringing that abundance back to California and learning about native plants and planting them, I think that could bring the conditions for something that can really be more egalitarian. Because I think even Marx, like his idea was, workers will take control of the factories and we'll have abundance, we'll produce all the right things. So a lot of these theories are about abundance and seeing what the planet and what California is looking like right now. That scarcity will bring more hierarchy and problems like that.
I don't know about you, but I feel like we're not even barely scratching the surface. I mean, I think we came up with more questions than answers. So, you want to?
But I think obviously like relationship building and like bettering yourself and everything is very beautiful. But one thing that really sticks out to me as when we were part of anti-US based struggles in Korea is when hundreds of us would just stack rocks in the middle of the road so the US military could not go on the road. So I think there's something really satisfying about stacking rocks.
Once again, thank you to Midnight Books. Just want to plug an event happening next week, relevant to what we were talking about too. John Y. Fernandez, educator, is going to be talking about educational equity here. I'm hoping to attend at 6 p.m. Friday night, right?
The book's right there. Everyone buy the book.
Which book is it? Can you hold it up?
Oh, there you go.
All
Buy a
right.
book, buy a book.
Okay, and then Midnight Books has a fundraising campaign going on, Ko-Fi.com, Midnight Books, Uptown Whittier. And I'm just plugging a great book, selling like hotcakes. And next month, I'm almost afraid to even say it, we are going to attempt to have a discussion on the Chicano National Question. Standing room only potential. And I'm going to say, leave all the weapons on the outside of the door, please. It should be a fun conversation. And finally, in the spirit of continuing these things, a quote from the futurist Alvin Toffler. If you don't have a strategy, you're part of someone else's strategy. So let's keep putting our heads together and see if we can formulate one. Thank you very much.